burning alive inside her husband's barn. A Lakota chief pulled her free and gave her safety. The smoke got into my lungs before I saw the fire. I remember that. You'd think it'd be the other way. You'd think you'd see it first, the orange climbing the dark, the way it ate the boards from inside out. But that night the wind was coming wrong, crossing itself, and the smoke rolled low across the grass and hit me full in the chest before I'd even cleared the tree line. I pulled up my horse. She felt it too, that mare. She wanted no part of what was ahead. I was coming back from 2 days at the river camp, a council thing, nothing that needs explaining here. The point is I was alone and I was tired and I was following the same trail I'd ridden 100 times. Flat land rolling out east toward the hills, a scatter of settler farms in the distance. I knew them by their lamplight, knew which one burned late, which one went dark early. You learn a country the way you learn a face after long enough. The Alderman place burned bright. Too bright. I didn't know the name then. I didn't know anything about that farm except it sat about a mile off the trail, a 2-story house and a barn and a low fence that always needed mending on the north side. I'd ridden past it maybe 40 times. Never stopped. White settlers didn't want me stopping, and I had no reason to give them one. But the fire was wrong. A man burning trash burns it small and contained. A man burning a field does it in the dry season and he watches it close. This was neither. This was something going up that wasn't meant to go up. I turned the mare off the trail. She didn't want to go. I put my heels to her twice firm and she went, but she tucked her head and her ears were flat. Horses know. By the time I reached the outer fence, the barn was fully involved, both sides taking, the roof starting to bow in the middle. The house was dark. No one standing outside yelling. No one running with buckets. No sound from the house at all. I pulled up at the fence, and I sat there a moment and I listened. And then I heard her. Not screaming. That's what you'd expect, and that's not what it was. It was lower than screaming. It was the sound a person makes when they've been screaming for a while and there's nothing left, when the throat gives out, and what remains is just this raw, tearing thing, coming from inside the barn. I was off the horse before I knew I'd decided to move. The main barn doors were chained. I could see that from 20 feet, a heavy chain padlocked, the kind a man puts on when he doesn't want something getting out. Not in, out. I took that in and I didn't slow down. I went around the south side looking for a gap, a window, anything. The heat was something else. You've stood near a big fire and felt your skin tight and felt your eyebrows go. This was worse than that. This was standing inside the heat, the air itself burning to breathe. I found a window, low, maybe 4 feet off the ground, the shutter blown out already. The fire was heaviest on the north side and the far wall, whoever had set this, and I already knew someone had set this. They'd done it at the north end first. The south corner near the window was bad but not impossible. Not yet. I went in head first. I'll tell you something about a burning building that they don't tell you. It's not the fire that blinds you. It's the smoke. The fire gives light, actual light, orange and shifting, and if you could breathe you could see. But the smoke drops on you like a hand on your face and your eyes go to nothing. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and I moved by the light of the fire itself, which is a terrible kind of seeing. Everything in orange and black, everything either burning or about to burn. She was at the far end, tied. I need you to sit with that a moment. A woman tied to a post inside a locked, burning barn. I need you to understand what I understood in that moment, which was that someone had decided she should die in here. That is not an accident, not a mistake. That is a sentence. She'd gotten one arm partway free. That was the pulling I'd heard, not screaming anymore, just working. Her shoulder was bleeding where the rope had cut. Her hair was half down and part of it had already gone, singed back from her left temple. She didn't look at me the way I expected. She didn't look like a woman who'd been screaming for her life. She looked at me with these dark, steady eyes and she said, very quiet, almost too quiet for the noise of the fire, "The knot is in the back." I went around the post. My hands were already burning before I touched the rope. The post itself was hot, starting to char. The knot was wet, I don't know from what, and it had cinched tight. I pulled my knife and I cut it. 4, 5 strokes and she came free, and I caught her because her legs went when she tried to stand. I got her to the window. She went out ahead of me and I came after, and when I got outside, the roof of the barn came down behind me. I felt the rush of it on my back, the heat that poured out the window like a hand shoving us. We got maybe 15 feet before I had to stop and hold her up. She was coughing so hard I could feel it in my own chest, bent over in the grass, one hand on my arm. I held her there. That was all there was to do, hold her and let her cough and wait. After a while she straightened up. She looked at the barn and she looked at the house, and she didn't say anything for a long time. The fire was loud, that cracking roar a big fire makes, and the mare had come around to us without being called and was standing nearby with her reins trailing. The woman said, "He'll say I did it myself." I said, "Where is he?" She said, "Inside, sleeping." Then after a pause, "He'll be awake now." I looked at the house, still dark. I said, "Can you ride?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, the way you look at a stranger when you're trying to decide whether to trust them with something that might get you killed if you're wrong. She was white, maybe 30, maybe a few years past that, and she had the look of a woman who'd worked hard for a long time without anyone noticing. Her hands were rope burned and cracked from something that had nothing to do with tonight. There was an old bruise on her jaw, faded to yellow-green, the kind that had been there for weeks. She said, "Where would we go?" I said, "Away from here. The rest we sort out later." She stood looking at me. The barn was folding in on itself now, the north wall gone, the whole thing eating itself. Then she put her hand on the mare's neck and the mare let her, which meant something. Animals know. She said, "All right." I got her up on the mare and I walked. My name is Chayton Eagleheart. I tell you that now because it matters for what comes next, not because of what it means to me. I've carried it long enough that it sits easy, but because of what it meant to the people I was about to have trouble with. I was chief of my band for 11 years by that time. We were maybe 140 people, living in the old way as much as we could still manage it, which was not as much as I would have liked. The pressure from the north and the east was constant. The buffalo were thinning. The treaty land was shrinking every time some new man in Washington decided it should. I spent half my time negotiating, and the other half holding my young men back from doing something that would give the soldiers a reason to finish what they kept starting. I was tired, not in the body, in the way that goes deeper than the body. My wife Wachui had been dead 4 years. She died in the second winter after a fever that took 3 of our children first. I've told that story only once in my life, to my brother Red Hawk, and I won't tell it here. What I'll say is that after Wachui I stopped expecting much. I did my work. I was good at my work. But there was a part of me that had simply concluded, like a fire that burns down to coals and gives its heat but makes no light. I had not looked at a woman with anything but courtesy since Wachui. I walked the mare through the dark with this woman on her back, and I thought only about what came next in a practical sense. Where to take her. How to do it without making things worse for my people. A white woman with a Lakota chief, depending on who told the story, could be a massacre or a kindness, and the difference between the two was mostly in the telling. I knew that. I'd learned it early and I'd never let myself forget it. I took her to the camp. There was some talk about that. Not from my people. They knew me and they trusted my judgment even when they questioned it, which is the only kind of trust that's worth having. The talk came later, from outside. That night what I got was Red Hawk meeting me at the edge of camp with his eyebrows up, and my Aunt Winona coming out of her lodge without a word, looking at the woman on the horse, looking at me, and then saying only, "Bring her inside." Her name, I learned, was Margaret Alderman. She told me this the next morning, sitting by Winona's fire with a blanket around her, and a bowl of broth that she held with both hands like it was the most important thing she'd ever been given. She said it plainly, no last name at first, then added alderman like she was admitting to something shameful. I asked her what she needed. She thought about that for a while. She didn't answer right away, which I respected. People who answer that question right away usually haven't thought about it. She said, I need to not go back. I said, all right. She looked up at me then. She said, that's it. That's all you're going to say. I said, what else is there to say? You're not going back. That's decided. She looked at the fire. She said, men don't usually decide things like that for me without wanting something back. I said, I'm not deciding it for you. I'm agreeing with what you already decided. You decided it when you got on that horse. She didn't say anything to that, but something in her face changed. Some held thing loosened a little. I saw it and I didn't remark on it. Alderman came for her 2 days later. He brought 3 other men with him. White men, settlers, the kind who knew each other from church and from trading days, and from the low understanding that there are some things men do for each other without being asked. He rode up to the edge of camp like he owned the ground under him and called out for the chief, and I came out and I stood and I looked at him and I waited. He was a big man, fleshy, with a red face and small eyes that were used to getting their way. He had a rifle across his saddle, but he hadn't raised it. Not yet. The 3 men behind him sat their horses loosely. One of them I recognized, Cutter. His name was from the trading post, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Alderman said my wife had been stolen, and he'd come to take her back. I said, she's not your wife anymore. He said, the hell she isn't. We were married in a church. I said, a man who locks his wife in a burning barn is not married in any way that counts. One of the men behind him shifted. Cutter said something quiet to Alderman that I didn't catch. Alderman said, that's a lie. She set that fire herself. She's not right in the head. You're harboring a dangerous woman and I'll have the law on you. I said, get the law, bring whoever you want. She stays here until she decides otherwise. He put his hand on his rifle then, not lifting it, just putting his hand on it, the way a man does when he wants you to know the option is there. I didn't move. I've had guns pointed at me by men who were afraid, and men who were angry, and men who were just stupid. And I've learned that the moment to pay attention is not when the gun comes up, but in the quiet just before, when a man is deciding. I watched Alderman and I saw him doing the math, me standing alone, 4 of them mounted, and I watched him see what I saw, which was that Red Hawk and 6 of my young men had come out of the lodges behind me without making a sound, and were standing in a line with their arms at their sides. Nobody said anything. After a while, Alderman took his hand off the rifle. He said, this isn't finished. I said, yes it is. He turned his horse and rode, and the 3 men went with him, and Cutter looked back once as he went. I stood there until they were gone from sight. Then Red Hawk came up beside me and said, in Lakota, he'll bring more. I said, probably. Red Hawk said, was she worth it? I said, it isn't about worth. A man chains a woman in a burning barn, you pull her out, that's all. Red Hawk looked at me a long time. He said, you haven't looked like yourself in 4 years, brother. You look like yourself today. I didn't answer that. I went back to my lodge. She stayed. Not because I told her to. Not because she had nowhere to go, though that was true enough. She had a sister in Missouri. She told me, but they hadn't spoken in years and she wasn't sure of the welcome. She stayed because she wanted to, and she was clear about that. Margaret Alderman was clear about most things. Once she'd had time to sleep and eat, and let the rope burns heal on her wrists. She helped Winona. Not asked to, not pointed toward it, she just started helping. She was good with her hands and she learned things fast, and she didn't treat my people the way most white women treat people who are different from them, which is to say she didn't treat them any particular way at all. She just saw them as people and acted accordingly. That sounds like a small thing. It isn't. We talked, she and I, in the evenings mostly, when the camp quieted and the fire was low. I don't know when it started being more than courtesy. I don't think there was a moment you could point to. It was gradual, the way a river shapes a canyon, nothing dramatic, just the steady work of time. She asked me about Wachui one night, not prying. She'd heard the name from Winona, I think, and she asked quietly and without pushing, the way you ask when you're genuinely willing to hear no. I told her a little, not everything, enough. She said, I'm sorry, 4 years is not very long. I said, long enough to know what's gone. She said, do you think a person can have more than one good thing in a life? I looked at her. She was looking at the fire, not at me, and there was something in her face that was both careful and honest at the same time. I said, I used to think a man gets one good season. One real one, and then the rest is just weather. She said, and now? I said, now I think I might have been wrong about that. She didn't say anything, but she looked at me then, and what was in her eyes was not what I'd expected, not gratitude, not relief, not the look a woman gives a man when she needs something from him. It was the look of a woman who has seen something she recognizes, like she'd been looking for a long time and she'd found it. I had to look away first. Alderman did bring more. He brought a federal marshal, a man named Greer, who came out 3 weeks after the first visit with a paper and a hard jaw and the air of a man who'd been told what to think before he arrived. I met him outside the camp the way I met everyone, standing still, nothing in my hands. He read from the paper. He said Margaret Alderman was the lawful property. He used that word, property, of Thomas Alderman, and that I was to release her immediately. I said, ask her. He said, the law doesn't require. I said, I know what the law requires. I'm asking you to ask her, because if she tells you herself that she's staying, you'll have a harder time explaining to whoever sent you why you dragged her out anyway. Greer looked at me a long time. He was not a stupid man, I'll give him that. He looked at me, and then he looked at the camp, and then he nodded once. We brought Margaret out. She stood in front of Greer, and she was very calm. She had her hands at her sides, and she stood straight, and she didn't look at me. She looked at Greer. He asked her if she was being held against her will. She said no. He asked her if she wanted to return to her husband. She said no. He asked her if she understood that she was choosing to remain with an Indian band on treaty land, outside the protection of the law. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Marshal, I was locked inside a burning barn by my husband. I was inside it for 4 hours before this man. She didn't look at me, came through a window to cut me loose. Tell me about protection of the law. Greer stood there. He folded his paper. He said, Mrs. Alderman, if you change your mind, ride to Harlow Creek. Ask for the marshal's office. He looked at me, Chief, and he turned and he rode. Alderman, I learned later, lost his farm to a debt not 2 months after that. He left the territory. I never saw him again. There is a moment I keep. I keep it the way you keep a stone in your pocket, something you touch when you need to know what's real. It was late October, maybe 6 weeks after the marshal's visit. The first real cold had come, and the camp was settling into the winter way, fires burning longer, people moving slower, the whole world going quiet and inward. I'd been up before light checking the horse lines, and I came back to find Margaret at my fire, just sitting there with her knees drawn up and a blanket around her shoulders. She hadn't lit the lamp, just sitting in the dark with the coals. I sat down across from her, and I didn't ask. After a while she said, I keep waiting to be afraid of you. I said, are you? She said, no, that's what I'm sitting here thinking about. I've been afraid of almost every man I've ever known, and I keep waiting for it to start with you, and it doesn't. I said, maybe it will. She said, no, I know the difference between waiting for something to happen and knowing it won't. I've had a lot of practice with both. I looked at the coals. She said, "You don't ask anything from me, Chayton. I've been trying to figure out what the catch is. Men don't do something for nothing." I said, "I pulled you out of a fire. That's not something you do for a reason, you just do it." She said, "And everything after?" I said, "Everything after is its own thing." She was quiet for a while. Then she got up and she came around the fire and she sat down next to me, close, the way you sit when you've decided something. She put her head against my shoulder, just that. Her head on my shoulder and both of us looking at the coals. I didn't move. After a moment I put my hand up and I rested it against her hair, very lightly, the way you touch something you're not sure is real and you don't want to frighten off. She said quietly into my shoulder, "I'm not going anywhere." I said, "I know." I didn't know. I hoped. But I said I know because some things you have to say aloud before they can be true. We were married in the spring. Not in a church, neither of us wanted that. Winona sang the old songs and Red Hawk stood witness, and we stood together in the early light with the plains washed yellow and the horses moving in the distance, and we made the promises that people make when they mean them. There was talk. Of course there was talk. There is always talk when two people decide to do something the world has opinions about. The settlers talked. Some of my own band talked. Greer, when he heard, apparently said something that amounted to disapproval, though he kept it to himself and his own fireside. None of it changed anything. What I remember about that morning is this. Red Hawk came to stand next to me while we were waiting for Winona to begin, and he looked out at the plains and he said in Lakota, "She chose you, brother, not you chose her. She chose you." And he said it the way you say something you want a man to carry. I've carried it. She chose me. That's the part that undoes me, even now, even all these years on. Not that I found her or saved her or provided for her. All of that was just what was in front of me to do. But she could have left. After Alderman was gone, after the marshal came and went, after the debt took the farm and the threat of it was over, she could have ridden to her sister in Missouri. She could have found a decent white man in one of the towns and started over the ordinary way. She stayed because she wanted to be here, because she wanted to be with me. That's the thing I couldn't earn and couldn't demand and couldn't manufacture out of my own effort. The only thing in my life that came to me freely, with no hand behind it pushing it my way. It came because she looked at me and saw something worth staying for, and she was a woman who told the truth. So when she said it, I believed it, and believing it changed me the way only a few things ever change a man. I had been concluding. That's the word I used before, and I'll use it again because it's right. After Wachui, I was a man in the last chapter of himself. Still doing the work, still putting one foot in front of the other, still leading my people with everything I had but concluding. The fire down to coals. She came back. I mean the fire, not all at once. The way fires come back, a breath of air, a shift, and what was coals catches again and you have light. We had good years. Hard ones too, because the world was not done pressing on us. The treaty land shrank again. We moved twice. There were winters where the food was not enough and summers where the soldiers were too close and my young men's patience was too thin. I aged into the work and the work aged into me, and there were days I was very tired. On those days, Margaret would find me. I don't mean she'd look for me. I mean she'd appear. She had a way of knowing without being told when I was at the bottom of something. She'd come and she'd sit near me and she'd do whatever she was doing, beadwork, most often. In the later years she learned the old patterns and did them well, and she'd say nothing for as long as nothing needed saying. That sounds small. It is not small. There is almost nothing in a man's life harder to find than someone who will sit with him in the hard times and not demand that he perform being fine. She never demanded that. When I needed to talk, she listened. When I needed her opinion, she gave it, plain and straight, which I valued more than agreement. She disagreed with me plenty over the years. She was right roughly half the time, which is better than most people manage. We argued. We came back to each other. We built the kind of understanding you can only build through time and friction and choosing, again and again, to keep choosing. My children, I had 2 sons left to me, Kohana and Sunkta. They took to her in the way children take to people who respect them. She didn't try to be their mother. She tried to be someone worth knowing. It took a few years for the older one, Kohana, who was 12 when she came and had his own grief about his mother. But she was patient with him in a way that asked nothing back, and eventually he came around. The day Kohana brought her the first fish he caught in the spring run, walked up to her lodge holding it out the way a boy holds something he's proud of, and a little embarrassed about being proud of, that was a day. I'm an old man now, not ancient, but old enough that my back tells me things every morning I'd rather not hear, and old enough that I can look back across the length of my life and see the shape of it from a height you can't get when you're down in it. I led my people for 31 years. We didn't have everything. We lost things I'm still not done grieving, but we held on to what mattered, and we kept each other alive, and we kept our ways alive inside a world that was trying hard to make us into something else, and that is not a small thing, and I don't pretend it is. And I had Margaret. She's sleeping right now, in the lodge behind me. I've been sitting out here for an hour, the way I do, the old man's habit of early rising that she's long since stopped trying to argue me out of. The sun is just starting to touch the ridge to the east. The horses are moving in the lower field. The air has that particular cold that comes before the light, when the darkness is leaving but the warmth hasn't arrived. I think about the chain on that barn door sometimes, the padlock. I think about what a man has to decide inside himself before he can do that to a woman he once stood in a church with and made promises to. I've never made sense of it. I've stopped trying. Some things don't deserve the effort of understanding them. I think about going in through that window, the heat of it, the smoke, the way she looked at me with those steady eyes and said the knot is in the back, not screaming, not begging, just telling me what I needed to know to get her out. I think that's the first moment I knew who she was, not when she sat by my fire, not when she chose to stay, right there in the burning barn in the smoke and the orange light telling me where to cut. A woman like that, a woman who keeps her head in a burning building, who sees a Lakota stranger coming through a window and doesn't scream, just gives him the information. You don't find many people like that, man or woman. You don't find many people who are that essentially themselves under pressure. She was that. She's still that 30 years on, a little slower like me. Her hair gone mostly silver, and she wears it long still down her back. The burned scar on her left temple that she keeps covered in the cold because it aches in the cold. She chose me. I keep coming back to that. Red Hawk said it and he was right, and I have never gotten used to it, which I think is the correct way to carry something like that. You shouldn't get used to it. You should keep knowing it every day, the way you know the weight of your own name. An old man, sitting outside his lodge in the cold dark before the sun comes up. His work mostly done. His people still standing. His sons grown and their children growing. His wife sleeping behind him, and when she wakes she'll come out and she'll put her hand on his shoulder the way she always does, and he'll put his hand over hers, and neither of them will say anything because there's nothing left to say that hasn't already been said, and some things don't need saying anyway. The sun is on the ridge now. The horses are moving. I'm going to go inside.